All right, I think we're good to go. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Dissecting the Intersections Between Immigrants, Human Trafficking, and Domestic Violence. I'm Therese Marconi, and I am a staff attorney at Nationality Service Center. I work specifically with immigrant victims of crime and immigrant victims of domestic violence. And I have Lindsay here as well with me.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lindsay Mosser. I am an attorney with Therese at Nationality Service Center. I am the anti-human trafficking specialist attorney here. And just to give you all some context, prior to working with NSC, I worked with human trafficking victims at a medical legal partnership with St. Chris, with the legal clinic for the disabled. And then I was a child advocate attorney with the Support Center for Child Advocates, working with DHS and foster youth. And they have a Working to Restore Adolescent Power human trafficking court within Family Court in Philadelphia, which I'm sure many of you know of. So in a few different realms, I've worked with human trafficking victims, and I'm excited to present today with Therese on how human trafficking survivors and domestic violence survivors kind of have similar set of facts, similar case examples, need similar supports, and then how we can find them some immigration relief to relieve some of those vulnerabilities. All right. So let's get started. A little bit about organization. I'm going to turn my webcam off because I feel like it blocks the slides. So let me do that. Okay. So we're celebrating our centennial year. We have been around for 100 years, and we have been welcoming and empowering immigrants to thrive in our communities and pursue a just future for 100 years now. So we welcome you to join us in this celebration, and we will be having some events that you can find on our website. A little bit about our impact and reach, and you guys feel free to go further into this slide, but we've really done a number of different things throughout the years in regards to assisting immigrant survivors all around, right? We're really trying to serve the whole person, the whole client. So we have legal services, we have healthcare services, we have mental health services. We have a wide variety of clients that we represent from around the world. And we really pride ourselves on being able to serve foreign nationals and immigrants in a number of different ways in order to have them have that just future and be able to go out and live in America and do what they want to do. All right, so today, the first thing we're going to do, we're going to define human trafficking. And I know some of you probably know about human trafficking, but I really want to put it into the context of how it relates to domestic violence. Therese is then going to take us through intimate partner trafficking. We're going to talk about traditional immigration relief that we use for DV victims. And then we're going to talk about how we're using the trafficking visa or the T visa in order to support domestic violence victims. All right, so let's talk about human trafficking. And before we get into it, we're going to show you a video, and this will give you some context as to foreign nationals and what human trafficking looks like to them. I will tell you everything we're going to talk about today is in regards to human trafficking that happens in the United States. So as it relates to the T visa and domestic violence / human trafficking victims, we're talking about those victims being victimized in the United States. We will talk about how traumas, either acute or prolonged traumas that happen in home country, create vulnerabilities to being a victim of human trafficking. But again, when we're talking about cases and proving a case, it is being trafficked in the United States. I do want to give a trigger warning. I love that we have this breakout session that you can go to if you need to take a break, get a cup of coffee, whatever you need, through this video and throughout this presentation, because it's pretty heavy. Thanks, Therese.
The vision in my mind, it's time for me to go. The reasons all around,
All right. So we'll talk a little bit more about general human trafficking first, and then we'll get into how human trafficking relates to domestic violence. And you'll notice in that video, while it is, kind of hard to watch, there isn't a domestic violence situation that's really portrayed. And that's because historically we haven't viewed domestic violence situations in the human trafficking context, but that is starting to change. So when we look at human trafficking, and when I'm trying to prove a human trafficking case myself for immigration purposes, or for prosecution or civilly, right? This is the definition that we continue to go back to. So there needs to be an action on behalf of the trafficker. Those actions includes the one listed here. I think for today's purposes, we're really looking at the recruiting, the providing for, the obtaining, right, of a significant other of a person by the means of force, fraud, or coercion. And all these, it's not an or specifically, it's and or. And then for the purposes of two things. So only looking for commercial sexual exploitation or forced labor. Nothing else within what you think of maybe trafficking is movable or actionable in the United States other than commercial sex or forced labor within the context of human trafficking. Next slide. So this is a huge slide, and you don't need to know everything that is on this. The purpose of this slide is really to talk about how long we've been dealing with this and what we're doing with this new law and how we're making it work in order to find justice for the victims and hold the traffickers accountable. So not until the year 2000 did we decide as a nation that we were going to criminalize human trafficking. And that is where we get the definition of both the labor trafficking and the sex trafficking. These definitions and this law was adopted from the United Nations portrayal of human trafficking. And it has been used, as we'll discuss later, in order to bring prosecutions against traffickers. Since 2000, you would think that the force behind human trafficking and the way traffickers operate has changed, since now they can be criminalized. In fact, that has not happened. And it is the second most profitable crime in the United States. It used to be third to guns, so it would be drugs, guns, and human trafficking. And now it is drugs and then human trafficking and guns. And the reason this is so profitable is because unlike a commodity you have where you sell it, where you move it, and then it is gone, right? A girl can be sold 10 to 20 to 30 to often 40 times a night, right? So you're making profit on that person repeatedly throughout days, weeks, months, years, right? I had one client who was a victim of commercial sex trafficking for 20 years. So the amount of money these traffickers are capitalizing on these victims is substantial. And we're talking about a $1.5 billion worldwide entity, right? Enterprise. So 2000, right? The nation says, all right, we have to do something. We're going to criminalize human trafficking. Not until 2014 did Pennsylvania decide they were going to criminalize human trafficking. And I think it's important to note that since then we have made some changes within Pennsylvania. And in fact, the nationwide trafficking in persons reports that we'll look at show states have been successful in bringing about these cases. However, it's not up to the standard it needs to be in order to make an impact on traffickers and their inability to traffic or unwillingness to take the risk, if you will. It's not a deterrent yet. And then lastly, not until 2018 did we decide to pass the Safe Harbor Law, which protects children from crimes related to being a human trafficking victim, wherein the trafficker has forced them to commit quote unquote crimes. Really, they didn't have any choice or free will. This took a while to pass because of the child prostitution misnomer that was going around in Harrisburg. There was some concern that we were trying to legalize child prostitution. That is not, so first of all, you can't be a child and be a prostitute, but also that was not the aim of the law. It was really to not further victimize or criminalize children who are victims of human trafficking, right? That creates more trauma. The other aspect of that we talked to a lot of prosecutors about was the inability to bring kids in on crimes or charges that may be lesser than some other charges, but at least they got them out of that situation. What we found nationwide was that this crime, like DV, really is victim-led. So number one, the victim knows when it's safe to leave. And number two, it has to be the victim's choice on when and how they are going to leave. The trauma bond here is real, just like it is for DV victims, right? So forcing them to get out of that situation, quote unquote, saving them from their trafficker, we found doesn't work. So instead, creating a safe place, not further traumatizing them, and giving them information about what is actually happening to them and where they can find a safe place where there are resources, there are food, basic needs being met, etc., is much more beneficial, both for the short-term acute traumas that we could cause, but then also for the long-term recovery of the clients, of the children, of the youth. Next slide. So here it is, our 2020 prosecution stats. They have decreased for a third year in a row. There have been 309, this is nationwide, right? 309 convictions, which is a decrease from 475 in 2019 and 526 in 2018. Of those 309 convictions, 297 were sex trafficking and only 12 were labor trafficking. State laws continue to form the basis of most criminal convictions. And now all United States have anti-trafficking criminal statutes. 46 states allow survivors to vacate or expunge their records. We're not going to go into this today. This is important for a lot of reasons. It is noted that it is not as influential or impactful for immigrants, right? So for foreign nationals who have any sort of charges or any sort of convictions, even if they're vacated or expunged, immigration court doesn't care. So it can be held against them, and we need to make sure and work with prosecution teams when they're bringing charges, if they're victims of human trafficking, to note what really needs to be charged and if some of those quote unquote charges or crimes were committed in fact because they were forced and they were done in the context of being trafficked. And then finally, 35 states have safe harbor laws similar to Pennsylvania's. Some have a wider gamut of what can be sort of not charged, or there can be what's the word, not pardons, but there can be other segues to different levels of criminal involvement or court involvement when you're talking about certain charges that we would bring. Next slide. So here's the power and control wheel. I've seen this in a lot of presentations this week. I see it all the time when we're talking about domestic violence cases and in that context. What we want to see here is the power and control is very similar when you're talking about sex trafficking and labor trafficking as it is when you talk about domestic violence victims. So it again is someone looking at vulnerabilities of someone else, taking advantage of those vulnerabilities, and then capitalizing them, in this case, for the purpose of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So what does that look like in the immigrant context? Well, we're talking about threats to the police or threats to call ICE. I see that in almost every one of my cases. You have no right to leave. If you do, I'm calling the police. No one cares that you are here. The police are not going to, they're not going to listen to you. You can't even speak the language. And if you call the police, you're going to get deported anyway. Debt bondage is another huge area that we see. I paid for you to get here. I paid for your K-1 visa, the quote unquote fiance visa. You owe me. You're never going to be able to leave unless you pay off that debt. And if you can't pay off that debt, then your friends, family, et cetera, back home, you better believe they're going to pay, either with money or with some form of retaliation that involves physical abuse, et cetera. Threats or treats the victim like a servant. In all of the domestic violence, human trafficking cases I see, that is prevalent, right? So we're talking about someone who owes somebody else with their labor. So that is cleaning the house, that is cooking, that is dancing, that is having sex on command, all those types of things. That person is there to serve the person in power and in control. Using nationality or using culture, a lot of times traffickers take advantage of cultural norms or nationality norms wherein the person, the victim or the person being trafficked says, you know they can't get divorced. They know they can't leave certain situations. If this is the father of their child, they must stay with the father of their child, etc. So those types of things are used against them in order to keep them in that trafficking situation. Lying about the police involvement in trafficking situations. So this isn't a crime. What I'm doing to you isn't a crime. Even if you call the police, nothing will happen. You're just going to make me angry, and I'm just going to retaliate more against you. Again, language access, knowing the language, understanding terms, knowing how systems work, knowing how the culture in the United States work, etc., all are used against them to create this like power and control dynamic. And then again, denying anything illegal or exploitative is actually occurring. So when I talk to a lot of my clients, they are not coming and saying, you know, I'm a victim of human trafficking. We're discussing some of the facts they've been through, their story, and then out of that, I decipher that this could be a human trafficking case. And then we talk about what that looks like and what their options are. Next slide. So specifically when we're looking at labor trafficking, I wanted to sparse this out a little bit. I think sex trafficking is pretty clear. I also think that's why we have more prosecutions when we're talking about sex trafficking, because it becomes very obvious when you're selling someone for commercial sex, right? This is a little bit more nuanced, and it's a little bit harder to prove. And even the government has some difficulties deciphering between, is this a human trafficking situation, or is this an unpaid, underpaid labor extortion situation? Those are two very, very different things that sometimes have similar facts. Same with domestic violence and human trafficking, right? Is this just a DV situation we're talking about? Or does this rise to the level of human trafficking, wherein the domestic violence is the means used to have labor trafficking, to have forced labor or commercial sex, right? Okay, so labor trafficking definition. We're talking about things that involve involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Next slide. Another big, lots of words, right? Big slide, lots of information, takeaways, right? So when you're talking about involuntary servitude, you're talking about a pattern or scheme or plan that is intended to leave the person, if they did not consider or continue to do what they were doing in such condition, they would suffer serious harm or physical restraint, or the threatened abuse or abuse of the legal process. So either threats or actual abuse of the legal process. The first one is numerous domestic violence situations. I am going to put you in this situation and that you are going to continue to do what I tell you to do. You cannot leave until I decide you're able. It's up to me. I'm in control. And if you do not continue to do what I tell you to do, you will suffer serious harm or physical restraint. A lot of domestic violence situations we see involve sexual abuse, physical abuse, abuse to family members, right? Those threats of abuse to family members, using children as a pawn, using pets as a pawn. We heard about that this week, right? Which was really hard to hear about if any of you attended that session. But all those things are part of the coercive nature, the forced nature, right? The fraudulent nature. If you're talking about threats of marriage and false intent in love and relationships, etc. The boyfriend pimp bond that we talk about in human trafficking. And then the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. So that's the same with calling ICE, getting them deported, continue to do what I say, or I'm not going to renew your visa, continue to do what I say, or I'm not going to marry you if I'm a US citizen and my partner's trying to get status or citizenship, etc. So all those things wrapped up meet the involuntary servitude definition of labor trafficking. Debt or peonage, that talks about a debt or debitor, and that debt arises mostly in these cases from either applying for that visa or helping them on that journey to get to the United States. So I paid $5,000 for that coyote to bring you here into the United States. You owe me. And you better believe that those traffickers know exactly how much to limit that person's paycheck. In these cases, if you're living in the home with a perpetrator, the amount of money they can spend on groceries, the amount of money they can spend on food or toiletries, etc., in order for that person not to be able to get out of that trafficking situation, to get out of that DV situation, right? So we see this all the time where money is also used as a controlling economic manipulator to keep those people in those situations of peonage or debt bondage. And then lastly, slavery, right? So we're using this word. It is in the definition of labor trafficking. It is not defined specifically by the Act or regulations, but it is understood as a situation in which one person has absolute power over the life, fortune, and liberty of another. So oftentimes when I talk about human trafficking and I talk about victims of labor trafficking specifically, I'm using all three of these definitions and plugging in the facts of a domestic violence situation in order to meet those definitions. And I will tell you that each one is impactful and can be isolated, but I'm using all three in a lot of different cases because the facts support those definitions of involuntary servitude, debt, bondage, and peonage, and slavery. Next slide. So again, when we look at the definition of human trafficking, we talked about the actions on the trafficker. We talked about the purpose. Really, the means is domestic violence. So instead of taking domestic violence in itself as the crime, we're talking about domestic violence as a means to perpetrate the crime of commercial sexual exploitation or forced labor. You can have both. I'm not saying you can't have both, and we can prove both. The facts allude to both, right? The boyfriend, the husband, the wife, forced them to have commercial sex in order to get the rent money. And then when they weren't having commercial sex, they were forced to stay in the home and clean the house, cook, no freedom of their own personal economic wealth, no freedom to leave. We're talking about sexual abuse. We're talking about physical abuse. All those things happen. We have both definitions met, both purposes. And yes, we're asking for both. Normally, though, I'm seeing one or the other. The barriers to self-identification, really quickly to note, this crime of human trafficking is often discoverable. It is not disclosable. So people, like I said, aren't coming and saying, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking. Lindsay, can you help me? Therese, can you help me? No, they don't. First of all, they don't know the definition of human trafficking. But second of all, there are so many reasons why they do not want to disclose the in-depth traumas that they have experienced. And these are just a few of them. The trauma bonding, like we said, the boyfriend pimp that some of you may be familiar with is similar to the bond with the domestic violence perpetrator. So you grow to love them. They have their good days, right? They provide for you. They keep you safe. All these ideas, all these things that kind of pull you into the relationship, right? That is the trauma bond. And they're really good at it. And guess why they're really good at it? Because they're making a ton of money off of you. So they're benefiting, right? They're profiting off the trauma bond that they form with you. Threats of violence and reprisal, we've talked about that. The false promises of security, love, a better life, this idea that you come to the United States and we will take care of you and take care of your kids and you can have a job and freedom and go to school and all these ideas, right? No. Language barriers, the fear, distrust of authority, debt bondage, personal ID and documents. That's a huge one, right? That's really your identification, especially if you're a foreign national. And then the last thing that we're going to go into a little bit further down the line is the shame, self-blame, hopelessness, and resignation. When we talk about these compound traumas that these victims have been through, right? We're talking about today in their human trafficking situation, if they're currently being victimized. We're talking about the trauma they experienced in home country, which forced them to leave, oftentimes, dealing with poverty, war, often, DV at home, sexual abuse at home, those types of things. And then the trauma on the journey, right? Again, the lack of food or access to food, fear of the unknown, not understanding if or when you're going to survive, right? This journey to then arrive to the United States and be a victim of domestic violence / human trafficking. Next slide. So who are these traffickers? So this is a wide gamut of people, difference in age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background. I have seen, the diplomats trafficking people. I've seen intimate partners traffic people. When I was at the support center, we had a mom who was trafficking her 2-year-old daughter to support her drug habit. So you have anybody and everybody. And again, why? Because there's money to be made and because there's not a lot of consequences right now to do it. In this case, the individuals and networks we wanted to point out are family members and intimate partners, right? When you're talking about interpersonal violence, when you're talking about domestic violence, these are the types of traffickers that we are looking at today. The The manipulators we talked about, and of course, they're doing it for forced labor or commercial sex. All right, so now I'm going to give it over to Therese, and she's going to talk to you guys about the in-depth parts of intimate partner trafficking.
All right, so defining intimate partner trafficking. So first, we want to start talking about domestic violence and what that looks like. It could be intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, or any type of family violence. In its broadest form, domestic violence involves violence against children, teenagers, parents, or the elderly. It takes on multiple forms: physical, verbal, emotional, economic, religious, reproductive, and sexual abuse. And abuse can vary. It can range from subtle, coercive forms of marital rape to violent physical abuse, which could involve choking, beating, female genital mutilation, and acid throwing, resulting in disfigurement to death. Domestic murders include stoning, bride burning, honor killing, and dowry death. So those are the more extreme situations. So what is intimate partner trafficking? So this happens when the abuser compels their partner to engage in commercial sex, forced labor, or involuntary servitude, which Lindsay covered. The existence of intimate partner relationship could lead to assume a situation is DV without considering it human trafficking. So when we're talking about intimate partner relationships, a lot of times it could look like domestic violence and not necessarily like human trafficking. Trafficked individuals sometimes live with their traffickers and are subjected to physical violence, emotional manipulation, and control, all of which we see in domestic violence scenarios. It's important to recognize patterns that are created between domestic violence and human trafficking in order to better help victims. So in doing so, we're going to look at the similarities and differences of domestic violence and human trafficking situations. So in similarities, we see that there is fears of or threats of deportation. Primarily, violence is perpetrated against women. It's all about power and control. The abuser and trafficker could be the same person. There is a relationship and trust that is, placed on the abuser that pushes or pulls into domestic violence or human trafficking. There is the strong bond with the trafficker abuser. There is fear and shame and guilt surrounding cultural beliefs. There's a lot of conflict about leaving or being isolated, and also exposure to various forms of abuse: physical, sexual violence, isolation and restricted movement, threats of harm, name calling, shame, controlling documents and finances, and threats to abuse the legal process, so threatening to deport. Now, there are differences in domestic violence and human trafficking situations sometimes. The legal definitions are different. Human trafficking is exploitation where the abuse perpetrated is for the purpose of forced sex or forced labor or commercial sex. And domestic violence is a pattern of abuse in intimate relationships. Traffickers, unlike an abuser in a domestic violence situation, most likely may exploit several victims. Trafficking victims may also be victimized by multiple people. And human trafficking is more likely to exploit men than domestic violence. So that's an important thing to note in understanding how to maybe help victims of human trafficking. If many are men, how does that change in our service and providing service? So we look at some risk factors. Human trafficking victims who may also be victims of intimate partner violence need the same comprehensive services as victims of domestic violence. So they are also in need of housing, legal representation, criminal immigration assistance, medical and mental health supports, and economic empowerment assistance. So when we're talking about DV risk factors, traffickers present opportunity for people at risk, usually women and girls, while they attempt to escape intimate partner relationships. So we've seen that sometimes victims of DV are trying to escape and are vulnerable and end up in hands of traffickers. Lack of economic resources and family supports are marks for intimate partner predators. So when somebody does not have a work permit or has no ability to work in the United States and is desperate to survive and is alone, they are vulnerable to these predators or potential abusers. And fleeing domestic violence makes survivors more willing to accept fraudulent job offers. And then we have the human trafficking risk factors, and victims of human trafficking inadvertently become engulfed in abusive intimate partner relationships while trying to escape sex or labor trafficking. So it's kind of the vice versa situation. There's also homelessness, limited services and resources, lack of social supports, and safety and security. So the victim service approach. So since there are a lot of similarities between the victims of domestic violence and trafficking, there is a similarity in the kinds of trauma-informed services that they require. This includes safety planning, housing stability, healthcare, mental health services, self-sufficiency, healing, well-being services. And domestic violence advocates traditionally emphasize providing services that are voluntary, non-judgmental, culturally and linguistically appropriate. Human trafficking advocates also emphasize providing services to survivors that are also non-judgmental, even if the survivor somehow facilitated their own border crossing or allowed for their own sex work. And it's important to note these things in terms of how the advocates are working in similar lenses, because traditionally it was domestic violence advocates who served human trafficking victims for many, many years, and still do because of lack of funding and at organizations and things like that, that would have a specific advocate, or that could allow for a specific advocate to help just human trafficking victims. So DV organizations and their role for both populations, I sort of touched on this in the prior slide. They need to understand safety concerns and importance of having a confidential location, have partnerships with local regional organizations to meet the needs of human trafficking survivors and spread awareness, have trauma-informed victim-centered services, which Lindsay touched on, that, especially in the case of human trafficking victims, they don't necessarily know that they are victims, and they just need to be shown or educated, and then for them to make the decision once they find that there is a safe way out. To collaborate with local law enforcement agencies, have advocacy experience, just like the hospital advocacy models, and other multidisciplinary trainings in legal, immigration, housing, trauma, and others. So some things to consider when expanding services to human trafficking and domestic violence survivors. When we're talking about human trafficking and intimate partner violence, safety concerns might be higher or more complex. You see, a lot of times these perpetrators threatening, even as far as retaliation against family members who are abroad, and continue conversation identify partners such as legal service providers, substance abuse programs, in order to have appropriate referrals and supports. Build up your staff capacity and trainings, and create response protocols for human trafficking DV cases. And this may change the way you screen people and the questions that you ask as they come in. Designate a point of contact within your organization for human trafficking cases, and expand the definition of domestic violence beyond intimate partner. And that's pretty much what we're discussing here today is, how domestic violence could easily take the form of human trafficking. Reviews gender-specific shelter policies and safety planning, addressing concerns for domestic violence and human trafficking survivors.
So Therese, if I could just touch on that real quick.
Sure.
Made me just think of an example. So when we're talking about the safety concerns that might be higher or more complex, specifically so if we're talking about this in the DVHT context, I think if you're looking at sex trafficking cases, this would be an element that I would highlight, because when you have somebody who's bringing somebody in under the guise of a relationship, right, and then they're forcing them into commercial sex, that is more of a, it's more of a business model, right? So instead of forcing them to just work for them in the privacy of a DV, situation, say either in the house or in some sort of organization that they themselves, the perpetrator, owns, they're involving third people to initiate and have commercial sex with their partner, right? So that creates more of a business model, quote unquote, and in my mind has a higher likelihood of retaliation, knowing family members, friends, colleagues, whatever, back in home country, and that retaliation aspect is much higher, because that person is not only just kind of working for them for free, but they're actually bringing them in money. So they're more of a commodity. They're seen more and used more as a commodity than in a labor trafficking domestic violence situation. So if you have somebody who comes in and is in a domestic violence situation, but also has signs of commercial sex, I would definitely talk more about family and home country and any sorts of threats that were used against that person, for retaliation against family members, etc. And when we talk about the T visa and the U visa, we'll talk about how we can protect those family members from that trafficker. That's all. Thanks, Therese.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to talk a little bit now about exposure to vulnerabilities. A lot of these vulnerabilities listed here are very particular to immigrant victims of domestic violence, and immigrant victims of human trafficking. So you have these traditional, fears of deportation, language barriers, lack of understanding their rights, unstable housing, difficulty meeting basic needs. And these vulnerabilities are something that are important to understand when we're serving this community, because these are many times the reasons why these victims do not seek help, or maybe don't understand that they are in a dangerous situation. So what we do when we identify these vulnerabilities is, okay, but there are resiliencies within this community as well, and how we use their resiliencies, the victims' resiliencies, to overcome these vulnerabilities and to come out of, the dangerous situations that they're in, whether it is, intimate partner violence, whether it is, a more traditional form of human trafficking like commercial sex, and things of that nature. So what we do is this client-centered social work practice to really gain on the strengths and of these victims. And how we do that is looking at, what were the motivations, let's say, for them coming to this country, and the ability and fearlessness to overcome the struggles and trauma maybe of their home countries, and how those skills actually work to their benefit in getting out of these abusive, coercive situations here in the United States. All right, so we're going to dive into now immigration and what is an immigrant. And because I think it's going to be a very general slide just to give you an understanding of kind of the different facets that immigration has and what an immigrant looks like in this country. So you have what are traditionally non-immigrant visas, which are student visas, tourist visas, temporary workers, and other temporary visa holders, which would be like the T visa or the U visa. And then you have immigrant visas, but we include also lawful permanent resident holder or green card holders, because these are non-citizens, but who have immigrated and have lawful status to stay in the United States for a more permanent time. And immigrant visas are similar in that nature, that the difference is that an immigrant visa has the, let's say, the point of an immigrant visa is for staying a longer period of time in the United States on a more permanent basis. And then you have undocumented folks. So these are people who do not have any of these visas or any of these identifiers or green card holders. And most traditionally, they entered the United States unauthorized and without inspection. But many times an undocumented person could be somebody who had a visa that expired. And so they are without status in the United States. And I just want to highlight that when we're talking about immigrant victims of domestic violence and immigrant victims of human trafficking, many times, even if they have a visa that is valid, they are still extremely vulnerable for different reasons. Even though they might have documents or things like that, sometimes we see that the abuser will take all their documents from them and they will not have access to their documents. Or they, like Lindsay had mentioned, they paid for them to get their visa and, is holding it over them. So just because somebody is documented does not necessarily mean that they are safe or have some type of leverage over folks who are undocumented. So I'm just going to touch quickly on the K-1 visa because Lindsay mentioned it earlier and is relevant to the human trafficking, intimate partner violence situation scenario. So it's a non-immigrant visa for a foreign citizen fiance of a US citizen. And it allows for the foreign citizen fiance to travel to the United States and marry the citizen sponsor within 90 days. Then once they're married, they can apply for, the immigrant can apply for their permanent residency status or green card. And just a side note, eligible children of the fiance applicant receives a K-2 visa for those children. And this is important to know in the human trafficking, intimate partner violence context because it is very common to have an abuser, maybe online, like you've seen on 90 Day Fiance, meet somebody and, persuade them, fall in love or get them to fall in love with them. I'm going to bring you to the United States. We're going to have this great life together, bring them over. And then once they're here, it's a totally different situation. The abuser, forces the immigrant to stay at home, does not allow them to leave, does not allow them to talk to anybody, and then you have a very questionable situation of potentially forced labor. So traditionally, the immigration relief for domestic violence victims were, and continue to be, the VAWA petitions and the U visas. So the U visas is for immigrant victims of qualifying crimes, and the VAWA petitions are for battered family members of green card holders or US citizens. So I'm just going to touch very briefly on these traditional forms of relief. And then Lindsay is going to touch on the T visa and how that's very new, and it's a new way to potentially give relief to victims of human trafficking. So just quickly, self-petitions for the VAWA are for spouses, children, or parents of U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents who have been battered or subjected to extreme cruelty. And they have to show 4 things: the existence of the legal relationship, the bona fide nature or the good faith nature of the marriage, so that they came into it loving each other and wanting nothing but the best for their future. Third, the fact that the couple resided together. And finally, the fact that the immigrant spouse was battered or subjected to extreme cruelty. And this entire process is confidential, and the U.S. citizen spouse or legal permanent resident spouse do not need to find out about it in any way, shape, or form and have no access to this application. It offers a path of legal permanent resident status and later citizenship to the immigrant victim. Some things to consider: it is a long process. There are filing fees and other costs. And, you know, a lot of times we do see a lack of documentation to show eligibility, and there's a risk of filing. I just want to highlight, when we talk about risk of filing, what we mean is if somebody is undocumented in the United States and they have been under the radar, when you apply to USCIS, you are in fact signaling to the US government that you are here in the United States and you do not have status. And that can carry some consequences.
So Therese, if I am a DV victim and my husband is also undocumented, is VAWA an option for me?
No. So that's why we have the U visas.
Cool.
The U visa elements are, you have to be a victim of a qualifying crime that occurred in the United States. The victim cooperated with investigation or the prosecution and suffered substantial harm. So the U visa comes in to play when we're talking about domestic violence situations where, like Lindsay asked, the immigrant victim is undocumented and the abuser is also undocumented. Or you have a situation where the abuser and the immigrant victim are not legally married. And the abuser could be a US citizen, undocumented, legal permanent resident, does not matter, but they are not legally married. So that VAWA petition is very specific. You have to be legally married to a US citizen or a legal permanent resident. Okay, so coming back to the U visa, some of the benefits of the U visa: it allows for the work permit, legal status for 4 years, and you can apply for a green card after the 3rd year. So this is just a list of the qualifying crimes. You see domestic violence is there, false imprisonment, sexual assault. And you see a lot of these qualifying crimes can be the behavior of a perpetrator of human trafficking. So just make a note of that. So the advantages of the U visa are, like I had mentioned before, if the immigrant victim is not legally married to the abuser, or the abuser is undocumented or for some reason is not a citizen or permanent resident of the United States, then it's a way of relief for these folks who wouldn't qualify under VAWA. And it provides a path to citizenship in the future. And also that you can apply for family members who derive benefits from it. Disadvantages. Why am I talking about disadvantages? Because, when serving this population, we always want to try to find the best relief possible for our clients. And the more options we have, the better. Sometimes we apply for them all and see, what works. But the U visa does have some drawbacks. you do need to cooperate with law enforcement. So the immigrant victim does need to cooperate with law enforcement, and this can be a major hurdle for immigrant victims. And like going back to the vulnerabilities that we had talked about earlier, language and fear of deportation, these are things that, we have to keep in mind when we're serving this population, and maybe they are reluctant to go and talk to law enforcement. Probably the greatest disadvantage of the U visa is that there's only 10,000 U visas a year. So they only offer 10,000. And if, those 10,000 get given out, then there's wait lists and more wait lists. So it can be a very lengthy process. All right, Lindsay, take on the T now.
All right, so let's talk about the T. So with the U, real quick, Therese. So if I don't have a certification from a law enforcement or a police report, right? Can I file for a U?
No.
Right. So I have to have that report before I can file, correct?
Correct.
And right now, approximately how many years is it for me to get my U visa?
Right now, it is approximately 5 years.
So 5 years. So I could qualify for a U, but I don't actually get my U visa until 5 years from now. Right?
Actually, no, it could be even longer. So right now, the U visa applications, it is taking 5 years just to be adjudicated. So just to get a decision if somebody qualifies or not, it's taking 5 years. Once they get to the 5 years and there's no more visas available, then you're put on a wait list, which is the majority of cases.
And approximately how long is a wait list?
The wait list, we don't have good numbers, but roughly a year.
Okay. And before the past 6 months, because there's been some movement here, but before the past 6 months, would I be able to get like a work permit while I wait?
No. So there's no work permit, but
I'm just in limbo waiting on my application.
Yeah. Correct.
And if it was still depending on the government, can I be deported while I have to wait for my U visa to become current or to get adjudicated?
So you could, in theory, yes.
Okay.
That is a risk.
Okay. All right. So here I am a domestic violence victim. I have reported or called the police, but the police have taken both our stories. There's been no police report issued. And my significant other is undocumented. So VAWA is not an option. U is not an option. And I come to an immigration attorney and I'm talking about the facts of the case. And the immigration attorney, Therese and I, decide that this might be a case for a T visa. So what is a T visa? So a T visa has 4 things, not just that you're a victim of trafficking. And I think this is really important when you talk about the context of VAWA, U's, and T's. These are reporting statutes, right? So the government has made these visas available for victims, yes, but the point is to report against these criminals. We as the United States feel it is important to bring justice and hold traffickers, people who assault other people, people who commit serious crimes, etc. We hold them accountable for the crimes that they have committed, right? So not only are you a victim of a crime, but then also there's this reporting part. What's different from the T than the U is I just have to reach out. If my client is over 18, I just have to reach out to an agency and tell them that I believe my client was a victim of human trafficking. Oftentimes that leads to an investigation, which is great because I want to get these traffickers too. Like I said, we're not prosecuting enough, right? But it does not have to lead to investigation. It does not have to lead to a report in order for my client to qualify for a T visa. There is a caveat for this. There's a carve out for if it would be too traumatic or cause too much stress for my client. That is a very high burden. And I rarely advise my client to use that excuse because ultimately we're going to have more evidence that we're going to need to submit, including psych evals, et cetera, to the government to prove why we did not report this crime. Because again, the point of the T visa is really to incentivize people who are not here with legal status, their visa expired, they came without a visa, et cetera, they're seeking asylum, to report these human traffickers, right? I also have to prove that they're still here in the United States because of trafficking. So if my client victim escaped from their trafficking situation 5-6 years ago, this is going to be a little bit harder for me to prove. Now, if she's still suffering from the trauma, maybe if she was forced to have a child at the hands of her trafficker, there's some connection currently present day to that trafficking that happened 5-6 years ago, then those are the arguments I'm going to be putting forth. But again, this becomes more difficult as more and more time passes after they've escaped that HT situation. I will tell you, because we talked about how this crime is discoverable, not disclosable, this has been an issue in a lot of my cases because people aren't coming and saying, yo, I've been trafficked, I'm out now, get me a T visa, right? A lot of people don't know this is even an option. And if they do, they've kind of finally been able to come to terms with how to cope with or want to move forward from their situation. And in the realm of like reaching out and getting other services, supports, etc., we figure out that they could also qualify for the T visa. The last thing I have to prove is that they would suffer extreme hardship if deported. This is not related or doesn't have to be related to the trafficking. Sometimes it is, right? If they are deported to home country, there's going to be retaliation there. The trafficker knows what they are. In fact, the trafficker has been retaliating against family members, neighbors, etc., so they can't go home. There's extreme famine at home. In Eastern Africa, one of my clients couldn't return because of the locusts. So there's a huge invasion of the locusts. The locusts have been eating all the farmland. The mom had 4 other kids there. There's no food for those 4 kids, let alone if her 5th kid had to return home. So those types of things would be examples of extreme hardship. Why do I want the T visa? Well, similar to the U visa. I can't tell you how many clients call us up and say, how can I get a work permit? Having a work permit is essential to having your own individuality, your own economic freedom, etc., right? Let alone your sense of self and a little bit of pride and being able to do what you want and need to do for yourself and your family, right? So work permit is essential. And you get that with the T visa. You get legal status for 4 years. You can apply for your green card. That should say 3 years. You can also apply early if there's no active investigation and we get a letter from the Department of Justice. So there's quick movement to getting a green card. Why does this matter? Well, a lot of you, I'm sure, have heard of things like the DACA and all that stuff where you can renew stuff. You really can't renew the T visa, right? You get it once for 3 years. You can extend it for certain circumstances, but that's too confusing to talk about. But then you're out of status again, right? So then you don't have a work permit again. And then you might have to return to a foreign country that you felt you were forced to leave, right? So like DACA, having the ability to get a green card and knowing that you're able to stay in a place that you consider safe and home and you want to build a life here, it's a really big deal. And this is one of those visas that allow for that. And then, like we talked about with Perez and the U visa, there are 5,000 visas available per year, and the government sets this number, right? Each year. But they're current. There's no wait period. So once my client gets a T visa or qualifies for a T visa, they get a T visa. They don't have to wait the extra amount of time in order for their visas to become available or current. And they're also processing them. Now, you'll notice 5,000 is much less than 10,000. It's interesting that we talked about human trafficking being the most lucrative crime or second most lucrative crime in the United States, and we're not hitting that 5,000 number for visas. In fact, we're having some rejected or revoked. So what do those numbers look like, Therese? Go to the next screen. So here we go. For 2020, the stats. DHS granted 1,040 victims T visas, which was a significant increase, shockingly, from the 500 that they granted in 2019. You can also apply for family members, right? So kids, depending on age, marital status, etc. And you can also apply for family members that are going to be retaliated against by the traffickers in home country, all right? Or if they're here and they can't return. So they granted 1,018 family member T visas, which was also an increase from the 491 of 2019. I think those numbers are dismal, right? So this option is available. We know it's happening, and the applications are going in. The advocates are applying, but those are the numbers we're looking at. This is also noteworthy, and Therese talked about this a little bit, about this notice to appear and risk of application. So the prior administration changed the law, and it basically said, and I'm going to turn my webcam on for this part. Okay. So before, you have the court, criminal court, or immigration court, and then you have USCIS, or the administrative body that adjudicates these applications. And they do not talk to each other, right? So they are two separate things under the Department of Justice, or under the US DHS, Department of Human Services. Big DHS, not Philly DHS, right? Okay. So they didn't talk to each other. Under the prior administration, they started to say, if you applied for a T visa and you were denied that T visa, USCIS had to tell the court, the immigration court. So you were at risk of deportation then, because we know you didn't get your T visa. Now you're here without status, right? So what other relief do you have? And oftentimes that answer is, well, none. Like asylum passed, or I don't have a strong asylum case. I've been here illegally, et cetera, or without status, et cetera. So that really creates a barrier for victims coming forward and saying that they are victims of domestic violence or human trafficking, right? And I have to tell them, you are a victim of human trafficking, but you might not meet the present on account of, like we talked about, because they were trafficked 7-8 years ago. Or you might not have extreme hardship because your trafficker's dead. There's no retaliation. And your home country, while there are issues there, right, it might not meet that burden of extreme hardship that the government wants it to meet. So I would advise you not to apply for the T visa. And in that case, I'm not reporting that trafficker. And so that trafficking situation can then go on. So those are just some issues with this notice to appear policy that has been rescinded under the new administration. The victims that we looked at are most commonly from the United States, Mexico, and Honduras. And the vulnerabilities include all the things we talked about today: child welfare and juvenile justice system kids, runaway homeless youth, unaccompanied minors that we're hearing about in the news, individuals seeking asylum. Refugees come with a status. So the definition of asylees and refugees is the same, right? It's just some people are waiting outside to get the refugee status and then coming in with that refugee status. Other people are saying, I cannot wait. My situation is desperate. It's dire. And I'm coming to the United States seeking that refugee status, seeking that asylum status, right? So these are people who are very, very vulnerable. And I will tell you, situations like COVID, impact people's vulnerabilities, impact people's economic stabilities, and therefore create more human trafficking situations. So we do feel once COVID kind of clears up, which it seems to be, fingers crossed, we will see inevitably more human trafficking victims coming out of the woodwork, like we thought with domestic violence victims who were really stuck in the home with their perpetrators. And now that things are starting to open up a little bit more, we are seeing more DV victims coming forward. All right, I'm turning this off. Next slide. So here are some DVHT prosecutions, right? These are federal prosecutions. These are examples of domestic violence type human trafficking cases that we can take. In Doe v. Faragala, a Moroccan citizen married a U.S. citizen only to find out he was already married with 2 children, and which she was forced to work as domestic servants in their home and as a janitor in their limousine business. This was in 2013 out of California. In Picardo v. Francisco, under the guise of love and promises of marriage, a Dominican Republic woman was forced to work in her trafficker's parking garage without compensation. She was awarded a default judgment of almost $1.5 million. This was out of New York. In Stein v. Worldwide Plumbing, a wife was forced by husband, in-laws, and additional relatives. So this is what we're talking about expanding the interpersonal violence, not just to be the husband or a significant other, but, family members are also involved in some of these human trafficking cases. So additional family members to work in their illegal fencing business. The husband used rape, physical abuse, holding the children hostage, seized wages, and forced her to work at the family-owned pizza restaurant. And lastly, in Mystery v. Uwadia, the wife was forced into domestic servitude when parents-in-law forced her to perform domestic work by confining her, controlling her diet, leveraging cultural practices, and threats of divorce and deportation. So basically, mom and dad were like, look, you're going to have to do all this stuff or we're going to have you divorce our son. and be deported. So you can see all the different manipulative factors that we have here. And again, these are from 2012, 2013, and 2014. These are also labor trafficking cases. So when we talked about the numbers of prosecutions happening, I believe that number was 12 labor cases for this year. This is not your average labor case, right? When we're talking about labor and human trafficking, we're talking about the restaurant industry, we're talking about the landscaping industry, we're talking about the construction industry. So the fact that these are prosecutions that held are big deals because the numbers aren't high. Now you'll notice in these prosecutions, these are not cases where the women or victims, survivors, etc., were kept just in the home, right? There is some element where they were forced to work outside the home in a family-owned business, or wasn't just the partner who was doing the controlling, right? They had some other family members as well. Next slide. So taking kind of that as an instructional basis, we have started to use the DVHT model to make T visa cases for all the reasons that Ez and I talked about. And so these are some of the cases that Nationality Service Center has worked on and won. One of the cases we had, a girlfriend was recruited by an older male online. They did not use the K-1 fiance visa. This person did not have legal status in the United States. So this was more a debt bonded situation where he talked to her on Facebook, sent her money because of school. You know, she wasn't able to go to school because she was working because her family was very poor and she didn't have a lot of money. So he sent her money and then he decided to pay for her journey. So she was indebted to him, and then come to find out that he was not who he said he was. So he was an older man, and when she arrived in the United States, she was locked in a basement, instructed to pay off her debt through commercial sex or drug trafficking. So it was nice, he gave her an option. And then through threats of sexual assault, deportation, and retaliation against her family and home country, he knew where they were. He had friends in that area. That was the coercive and forceful methods used to get her to try and sell herself for commercial sex or to traffic drugs. This was an intent to traffic case. So I should say that those are types of cases we can bring where you can show that luckily the person was able to escape that situation before it happened, but they're still reporting that this trafficking situation was bound to happen, right? And also in that case, the family members eventually fled that area after they sold their home to the trafficker in order to free their daughter from that situation. So they gave her over control of their house and their only car in order to get her out. And some of the family is safe and some of the family are still in hiding. In another case, a wife and a son were forced to work in the family corner store. So in this case, the wife and son lived on top of the corner store. It was essentially the same building, and they would go up and down from the store to the apartment above. The significant other used sexual abuse, physical abuse, threats of deportation, money manipulation, and other methods to control that wife and son. In another case, I had a transgender girlfriend who was forced to clean and cook her boyfriend's apartment. She was locked in during the day, and when he was home, she did not feel she was able to leave. Constantly monitored, raped on a nightly basis to establish and keep control, and the fear of deportation was used. And then lastly, a wife was forced to work in the home for her husband, cook and clean elaborate meals, clean all day long. And in this case, it was really minute detail, cleaning the bathroom floor with a toothbrush, cleaning the toilet with a toothbrush, cleaning the bathtub with a toothbrush, organizing his clothes every single day in the hamper or in his drawers. And then he would come home and take everything out and tell her how terrible a job she did and she doesn't know how to fold clothes, beat her up, sexually assault her, and then she would have to reorganize all his stuff, etc. She was also forced to entertain his friends by cooking for them, waiting on them, dancing sexually for them. She had limited mobility, and he used threats of deportation in order to keep her in that situation. So these are all T visas that we were able to get for these clients based on these sets of facts. So depressing, right? it's happening. Like we said, it's happening on a really large scale, and everybody's doing it. So from intimate partners to diplomats to, people in all different walks of life who can make money off of human beings as the commodity, right? So what can we do? When we look at the economics of it, we have to focus it on it, kind of three ways. If we just attack it on one end, it's not going to work. So the customer, us, right? We can examine our own slavery footprint. We can buy fair trade. We can know where our products are coming from, and we can make sure that they don't have on some leg of the line, right, some human trafficking or labor trafficking aspect to it. Money talks. That's what's kind of forcing this, right? That's why people are doing the trafficking. So if we can limit that, the money that they're getting, maybe they'll stop. And then just taking the pledge not to buy sex. There is a lot of current conversation and discourse about whether or not to legalize prostitution. In my work with survivors and work with youth, I do believe that doing that would lend itself to a lot of vulnerable and manipulative situations wherein sex trafficking can not only occur but grow. So I do think it's important that we continue that conversation. But taking the pledge not to buy sex is really simple, and I think that it's important for all of us to do it, because right now you are taking advantage of somebody who is vulnerable and likely has a lot of trauma history, a lot high ACEs score, et cetera, and you are taking advantage of that situation in some way, and you are inevitably supporting a human trafficking situation. We have to prosecute the traffickers. Like I said, we're not doing it enough. And there's a lot of reasons why that's happening. And I know COVID has limited the ability to bring a lot of different types of cases, right? But if the traffickers don't feel threatened and there isn't a deterrent to trafficking, they're going to continue to do it. And I can't tell you the number of labor trafficking situations I've seen where people just kind of change their names, right? They just reincorporate under a different name and continue the same labor trafficking practices that they've done. It's really quite remarkable. So we have to hold them accountable, and there needs to be serious sentences handed down because of the trafficking they perpetrated on people. And then lastly, what we're all doing here is supporting the victim. So having survivor-led, survivor input type of systems to support and get these victims out of these situations and then keep them out. So what we say before is, right, like if you have all these traumas and all these experiences, you become more vulnerable. And so if you are a victim of human trafficking, inevitably you are more vulnerable to become a victim of human trafficking again, if there are not supports or services ready to support you to deal with the trauma and then to support the resiliencies that I was talked about in order to move forward from all those traumas. Next slide. Protection and prevention, we're doing it right now, right? So be aware of the recruiting tactics. They target victims through social media, chat lines. I worked with the FBI on a few talks, and they talked about, it's amazing how well the traffickers know these social media platforms. So what he said, with his own kids is they're not allowed to use the phone in the bathroom or in the bedroom because most of the online stuff he's seen, children or youth were taking pictures in the bathroom or in the bedroom. So you see the curtains in the back, you see the bedspreads, etc. Likewise, some of the cases that have been prosecuted have used things like that in order to link the photos, the advertisements, the recruitments, etc., to known places where traffickers were residing. So when you look at the advertisements, you could see a similar hotel bedspread in each picture, right? And then they were able to use those types of evidence to connect the dots. This is because in order to prosecute these cases, a lot of times you don't have a lot of evidence, right? And if your witness is traumatized, and we all know about trauma brain and how things are not always organized, the timeline can be difficult to come from the witness, victim, etc. Or there's the trauma bond still and they don't want to testify, all the reasons, right? It's really difficult to find the evidence to bring about these convictions. So I would highlight the social media stuff, and I would caution if you do have children or youth who are using them to just be monitoring them and have your own boundaries and restrictions to make sure, they're not susceptible to being vulnerable to these guys. Ask questions about youth friends or family friends. And, when you're talking to domestic violence victims, ask about anything else they were made to do. And that could result in a HT referral. And if they're foreign nationals, refer them to an immigration-based resource. We do the extensive assessments, and we can figure out what immigration relief that is available to them, if any. And that really helps to restore some of their vulnerabilities, right? Because if you have status and you're able to get a visa and eventually a green card or a work permit, you aren't as susceptible or vulnerable to these types of human trafficking and domestic violence situations. Understand that trafficked youth are not victims, and then report any suspected trafficking, right? So call 911, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Next slide. I think that's it. And here's our information. So we did want to leave time for questions and answers. If you guys have any, you can throw them in the box. I don't think you can unmute yourself. I will come back face to face. We covered a ton of information, so please feel free to. So we have one question from Denise. Thank you, Denise. If every administration can change the NTA policy, aren't some victims caught in the middle of the process when the change occurs? Or by no wait period, you mean that they can get the T visa within a month or so? Are there, and therefore plan around elections, potential changes? Amazing question. So right now, we do feel like we have enough time with the T visa to apply and get the results. I will tell you, it usually takes between 6 months to a year and a half, depending on the type of evidence I submit and the person who gets the application, because these are people who are reading these applications, right? Some of them are pretty good and know how to work through the elements or the requirements, and others are kicking back stuff for really basic things or even things that I submitted. It can be frustrating, but great question. Right now, we do feel like we don't have to advise that our clients are at risk. When the election comes up, we will, again, bring that to clients' attention, and it is always up to the client. So I have some clients who don't want to apply for a T visa because they refuse to admit they were a victim of human trafficking. I have clients who don't want to report to law enforcement because it was the trauma of on their significant other or a family member. So this would be another tidbit of information that we would give to the client in order for them to assess what they would want to do based on our advice and likelihood of getting the T visa, and then we would move forward from there. I do think if the administration changes and, for example, Trump is elected, this NTA policy will be put back in place. Any other questions or concerns? Great question. Any thoughts, any case examples of survivors or victims that have come to you and maybe have potential for these types of cases? Or have you dealt with any human trafficking victims who, you have a really good example of how to support that person? Trying to think of other examples that I've worked with. In the DVHT context, I really think, when we're listening to our clients' stories and we're going through the affidavit process, which is a lot of the evidence that Therese and I submit with our applications, they focus heavily on the DV aspect. So that is the most traumatizing part for them, right? The sexual abuse, the physical abuse, all those crimes that are in and of itself acute traumas. And I think the hardest part for me is to explain to them, in the final affidavit when we went through it, a lot of those facts are not kind of harped on. And I really focus on the labor, or I focus on the commercial sex, because that is the ends that the government is looking for. They really want everybody to hear their story and to have that story heard and to feel vindicated by, receiving this visa because of all of that torture and trauma that they experience. And that's, I think, the caveat here is really, the DV isn't the end, right? The DV is just the methods that they're using in order to get that labor or in order to get that commercial sex. So it's a little different in the conversations that we have with clients and in the affidavits that we end up with. But you still want to give respect to that entire story and then support that client with all the interventions they need to work through that trauma. So at NSC, right, one of the cool things about working here is before in my other nonprofit lives, I had to refer everybody out, right? So you're going to JGPI for kids therapy, you're going, to all these different amazing organizations, but it's all outside referrals. With NSC, we have so much on staff. It really makes it easy to do those warm handoffs, which, as we all know, working with these types of victim survivors is really important to make sure they get the care they need and that you're working with people that you trust and count on and kind of know how to do this work and can do it in a language that they speak, right? Which is also really important. Therese, do you have anything you want to wrap up with, end on?
No, I think if nobody has any other questions, we do have the slides in the resources tab. So if you want to have access to the slides, they're there, and our contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, you can always email us, and we're happy to help.
Yep, our information is there. Thank you all so much for coming today. We hope you got a lot out of this, and now we can move on to the award ceremony, which I'm excited about.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye, guys.